Welcome back to the show, everybody. A few people have asked about X231 and whether or not old Christine here has started marking her spot on the shop floor. And so far, no drips from that back end since we filled it up. So hopefully she stays in a good mood. Just stay in a good mood, please. And I threw these levers together really quick because I wanted to show you all something I found during the cleaning process. Look at the welded copper strands that are on that sharp edge of that pivot, and these levers, when they're assembled onto the tractor, will be in this area right here. And the 445 parts tractor that lift came off of also stores the battery inside of a cut-in compartment in this right side fender. So there's a lot of battery cables that would have been routed right along these levers, and I think they let one of them get pretty rotten to the point that the insulation either cracked and fell off, or it rubbed through to the copper as that pivot was working, and it started shorting out on the metal. And the reason I threw these together real quick was to show you I found more copper and arcing right there, a little bit more arcing on that middle lever, and a little more still right here on this linkage lever. So that's how these old tractors started themselves on fire back in the day, letting the electrical system get quite degraded. So I'll bust this back apart real quick. And with that, I've got that old copper cleaned off of those pieces. Just wanted to show you all what was going on there. So we've got the stage set to reassemble the control quadrant for X231's 3-point lift. And this assembly will answer all the questions people had about how all those valves are moved at the same time within that valve block. And this is a rather difficult one because we can't really go through and explain what does what until it's all back together. So, and that's where I lost a lot of people in disassembly. I didn't get into any details when we took this apart because I kind of couldn't. I knew I couldn't. So that was kind of a eat your vegetables and get on to the next type of episode. So once again, we're just concentrating on everything that's on the green rag here on the bench. Another funny thing too, last time people said, that doesn't look like a green rag, we think that's blue. So there's the footage from last time. Here's the footage from this time. And here is a blue rag. Can we see the difference? Blue? Green? Yeah, it's always been a green rag. Either that or I'm losing my mind. Let's get started. Okay, first pieces back in are the two spool control forks, as Malene calls them. And these are pretty much the same, with the one exception being the top one has these two raised bumps on either side of that hole. The bottom one does not have the bumps. And these are the ones that are held in by the pins that have these very shallow snap ring grooves in them, and the tiny, tiny little circlip type snap rings that hold or that go into the grooves. And you can get the pins put into the openings down here through that plug hole and that plug hole. That provides you your access, top and bottom. Okay, so the best strategy I've found for dealing with these small clips is to start the clip on the end of the pin first, before the fork is even in the way. And these GoPros are horrible with close-up shots, so we can fall back on pictures. But that's what I've done here, and the little groove for the clip is down on this other end. So the thinking here is we can slide the pin back out of this ear just far enough to get the fork positioned in there, and then we will use the screwdriver to push the pin back through the fork, and the fork will carry the clip on down the shaft until we can get the shaft in far enough that that little clip groove comes into the inside of this ear, and then it will snap right in place. That's the only way I've found of doing this that doesn't send that little clip flying, and if those little clips fly, they are never seen again. Just about getting, or it's all about getting everything lined up. There we go. Click, that little snap. All right, bottom one's done. Top fork now, same strategy, except I have to preload the clip on the pin with the pin in the fork because this just has that really narrow pivot right there. And it's a shorter pin. We don't have to feed that one in through the side using that opening. So Make sure we stay captured here. There we are, pushing the pin through. Click, there we are. So, top and bottom. Good. And without wandering too far off into the weeds too early, I can tell you that these two pivoting forks are what allow the control levers to also depress that center master spool valve anytime any other valve is actuated. So it doesn't matter which direction you pull the control levers, you pull them one way, one of the forks will depress that master spool valve. You pull the lever the other way, the other fork pivots up to depress that master spool valve. Both of those foot pads line into that center hole, and the center hole is where the end of that master spool sliding valve sticks through. So I think you're starting to see now why I chose to go through the valve block and spool valves first before we did the controls, because now that you know what all those things are, I think the controls are going to make more sense as we go through it. And that illustrates one of the issues, one of the problems I've had with this system is choosing where to start to begin explaining to people how everything works. This is one of the tougher ones I've ever had to try to wrap my head around as far as, you know, giving a good explanation. Next, we start fitting control levers into the housing tube. These control levers are unique in the way that they all fit together. So here we have number 1, followed by number 2, and finally, number 3. They all stack in just like that. So that means that they also have to seal to one another to keep all the oil from leaking out. So we start with this, this first lever. It's got the largest tube. That's the one that goes into the housing first. And we have this O-ring back here, fits into this recess right there. That is a Minneapolis Moline number 10A2926, which is just a standard dash number 211 sized O-ring. So then we need to seal this second lever inside of the first. So we have another O-ring groove down in there a little ways, you can see it. That is this O-ring right here that will go inside. That is a Minneapolis Moline 10A7799, which is just a dash number 115. Again, standard sized O-ring. So now we have the solid shaft lever goes inside of the middle one. And down inside, once again, you can see that groove down in there. Another O-ring goes there. That's this smallest one. That's a Minneapolis Moline 10A10280, crosses to a dash size 112. Once again, standard O-ring. With the new O-rings where they need to be, I'll start throwing the auxiliary levers together. And very important step, remember to put the centering springs on before you start throwing anything together. We'll just have to be careful to avoid damaging the O-ring inside of this lever while we slide the other one into it. There we are. That's good. Second centering spring has to go on like this. And then we can start assembling these into the quadrant plate. You go through the center hole like that. And get this first one aligned in. Get it past the stops. All right. Here's our outside one, our second one. There we go. Both are in where they need to be. Now the assembly can be put into the housing. Once again, careful not to damage the O-ring there. Start it in gently, work it through, and run it down. Now I've started the two quadrant plate bolts, one right here, the other right there, and they're loose. They're just holding everything together. So this is the most difficult assembly step of the entire 3-point lift, the whole thing. It's trying to get our round peg bolt down through the centering springs that are on each lever. And I've got these centering spring legs just hooked on the tang that is on the bottom of each one, but you need to be careful because you can still pop those loose and then you have to reset. But they're not spread far enough apart to get our round bolt through. And I fought this for probably an hour when I did X253. About the time I finished, I thought, you know, I think I know how to modify a pliers to make that a lot easier. That was 2005. 20 years later, I have my chance. So I found this old Kmart pliers. It was the cheapest one to modify. And I've cut half of each jaw tooth away. And what we did here is stagger them so that when they come together, they'll actually pass by one another. See that? They don't just stop where normal pliers would. You actually get some more travel. So we will be able to hook both of the legs with a jaw, and we should get enough compression on that spring to open that gap, drop our pin bolt right in, our round bolts. So let's see if my theory plays out. All right, we have that one so far. That was easy enough. So let's pivot those out of the way. We need to get the lock washer down in there. Why they put one there, I don't know, but they did. Spread that bottom spring a little bit. Okay, I think we're far enough where we can start threads. There, we're started. I still wouldn't say that this was a smooth process, but we're just a little bit over 4 minutes recording on this clip. A lot of that will end up being edited out, but there we are. Yeah, that worked a lot better. And I had to get a bigger screwdriver too. But 4 minutes versus an hour. All right. They work smooth, so now we just finished tightening in the other two quadrant plate bolts, and these levers are home. Back to the bench. You guys ought to be able to see in here now without a problem. So we have both of our aux levers installed. The one on the inside I've referred to as aux 1, and when I move that lever, you can see only the larger of the two shafts rotates. Okay, so then aux 2 lever just outside of that, when I move that one, just the smaller of the two shafts rotate. And each shaft has some flats milled into it. Those flats are what grab onto the levers, the pivot levers that are about to go on. So to put the pivot levers on, we first start with our spacer with the stack of shims. And these are to set proper clearance to center everything up with the valve block. So spacer and shims go on first. Now watch what I do here. We're going to go back and we're going to pull aux 1 slide valve out of its spool. So here's our slide valve. We covered all this the last time. Here's our pivot lever. The two flats on the shaft register with the two flats on the lever. We have a couple set screws with jam nuts too. That's what's about to make all the magic happen. So we have to guide the slide valve down through the lower portion carefully, and then we just slide the lever onto the shaft. Okay, so now we have our next thin spacer goes on. Now I'm going to pull aux 2 slide valve out of its spool in the block. Okay, same type of lever, it's just the opening's a little bit smaller to fit that smaller shaft. So this one, the slide valve will go through the upper portion and then slide on, just like that. And now it's time to throw the outer lever on. So once again, we'll start that shaft through that O-ring inside of the other lever. Make sure we don't damage it. And we don't go all the way in with this one, just part way. This small spacer goes on the shaft next, rides up against that pivot lever. Now we've got our cam piece that has to slide on. Needs to be present even if we're not pinning it in location yet. Okay, and I'll push this outer control lever in just a little bit more, gain a little more real estate. Now pivot you all up, look up in the corner here. I'm pulling the lift spool slide valve out. This is the piece they call the bell crank. The lift spool valve slides down again through the lower portion of the housing, and the bell crank goes on the shaft. This bell crank just floats on here. It is not pinned. So as long as it's present, we're doing good enough. And finally, This little piece, once again, is called the tension spring lever, and all this is going to make sense as soon as I can show you how it all works. But in order to actually move anything, all of this has to be secure and in place. Roll pin in the cam, and roll pin in the tension spring lever. And flipping this around, it starts to look a bit familiar again. We've got aux1 and aux2 slide valves here. We learned what they do the last time. We have the lift spool slide valve here. We know what that does from last time. Now Squatchy's about to take us all off the rails here because it's the only way I can think to do what I need to do next to show you all how this mechanism works. Let's stud this up. Valve block. Put it on. These valves slide in the spools a lot nicer now. Tip it up. Springs, large 5/8 in the middle on the master. We have the 9/16 with retainer on the lift. We have the 1/2 inch on the aux, the other 1/2 inch on the aux, and filter housing. Filter housing has these nubbins in here to center the springs. So to get our spring pressure right, we need to have filter housing on the front. Hand tight is all we need for what we do here. Rotate around, lift it up, set it up on its snout. Now, we can begin to see how all this works. All right, I had to put all of this together because it's the only way we're going to see what happens when a lever moves a valve, all right? And that's been my difficulty this whole time, like I said. Unless everything is present, you won't see anything happen at all. So it makes it really hard to explain to people how it works, but here goes. So we've got our aux1 lever pivot here, and this side of it has a set screw with a jam nut. The other side has a set screw with a jam nut. aux2 lever pivot is here. Same thing, we've got a set screw with a jam nut on this side and a set screw with a jam nut on that side. We'll just be looking at aux2 for now because it's closest to the camera and it's easiest to see, and I'll move it for you. You see aux2 moving, it pivots. All right, so that's what we're looking at. Now, down in the middle here, underneath the forks, here's the upper fork, here's the lower fork, we have the master spool slide valve, and each fork is resting on the end of that valve right now. And here's how the system works. It's very simple. So I'm going to take aux2 lever, so that's going to move our aux2 slide valve. So when I move the lever forward, you can see right up here, it's pushing the slide valve into the spool. But when I pull aux2 lever backward, now we're pulling the slide valve out of the spool. So that's how you get your directional fluid flow. Push it in, fluid flows one way, pull it out, fluid flows the other way. But you'll also see we've got the upper fork and the lower fork both move down regardless if I'm pushing aux2 down into the spool or if I'm pulling aux2 out of the spool. And that's where these set screws and jam nuts come into play. Each set screw presses on a fork. So this set screw presses on the upper fork, this set screw presses on the lower fork. And it works like a children's teeter-totter, a seesaw. So it doesn't matter if you are pushing aux2 down in, the upper set screw is going to push the upper fork down, which also pushes the master spool at the same time, or you're pulling aux2 out, your bottom set screw pushes on the bottom fork and pushes the master spool valve in. So that's how you can synchronize the master spool with whichever auxiliary spool you happen to be actuating. And a different view now, we'll move aux1 valve. You can see the process is the same. Regardless if we pull aux1 out or push aux1 in, those forks are pushing on the master spool down in the middle. So we've covered what aux1 and aux2 levers do in there. That just leaves us with the outer main lift lever. And when that lever moves, It rotates the cam, the tension spring lever, the bell crank, and it works the lift spool slide valve down there in the corner. Operation of the lever: when you put the lever down, the arms will go down, and when the lever is down, the spring that is behind the filter housing here pushes the lift spool valve back, and that lets the spool valve dump all the fluid out of the lift cylinder. Next is the hold position, and that happens when all three levers line up with one another. So we'll rotate back down so you can see what happens as we come up and line in with the other two levers. Right there, that pushes the lift spool valve in, centers it out with its spool, and it blocks all fluid flow to or from the piston. So that is what's going to hold your arms in whatever position you want them to stay. And finally, we have the raise position, which is right here. That's all the raise travel you get right at the very top of the quadrant. So we're in hold right here, and if we pull it back to raise, you see it just pushes that lift spool valve all the way forward, and that's what puts fluid into the piston cylinder. So we get the arms up where we want them, we just go back to hold, and it holds them. Could be halfway up, could be 3/4, could be all the way. We want the arms to go down, we go forward, that spool valve dumps fluid back out of the cylinder until we get the arms down where we want them, pull it back to hold, then they'll stay. So this is up, this is stay put, this is down. Easy as that. Now all we have to do is tie the draft control linkage into that, and we'll be done. This is called the overload spring. It is on the cam follower. I took the overload spring apart back when I was into X253. I do not recommend. I wanted to take it all apart, clean it really well. Well, it was very fun keeping this spring compressed long enough to hammer roll pins back in. Somewhat dangerous. Now I just leave these together. You can still clean them just fine. So, overload spring cam follower, this spacer goes over the end like that, and all those pieces just slide into this cylinder, like so. These two rods up top are what move the master spool valve through the top fork here, and the lift spool valve through the bell crank right there at the same time. They both move in unison. And I mentioned when I took it apart that we were missing this clip up here between the jam nuts. I pulled the clip out of my parts lift, so we have a good one in there, and that clip needs to be present for that rod to push on those two little ears on each side of that hole. And the cam is what presses on the cam follower right here. And this whole system works off of the pivoting mechanism at the back. You'll see this a little better after I put it together, but here's how the pivoting action works. So this is our draft control plunger, sticks out the back of the housing. Pivot hinge is back here with that stop bolt. So this plunger doesn't move in this scenario. If we are running the arms up and down with the lever on the side, the cam is rolling back and forth. So when the cam pushes on the cam follower, we get the pivot action going back here. When these two rods travel forward, that is master spool, lift spool, both get engaged, and lift arms go up. So here's how it works with the control lever. So this is arms up, that's arms down. Arms up, arms down. Now the draft control works off of the same pivoting action back here, just in reverse. So for the draft system to work, the lift lever has to be all the way down. That means the cam is no longer pushing on the cam follower. The cam is in one spot and it's acting like a stop up here. So now it's this end that doesn't move. But the pivot hinge is waking up back here. Say we've got a plow in the ground and we hit a rock. As we discussed earlier, that force is transmitted up into the top link. That depresses the pivot hinge on the back of the housing, and our adjustable bolt pushes in on the draft control plunger. So now this is how the pivoting action works. So we hit that rock, pivot hinge comes down, pushes the plunger forward, both these rods go forward, that tells the arms to lift. Once the plow gets off the rock, well, then that pivot hinge relaxes again, it lets all this stuff drift back, that lets the arms go back down, plow is back in the ground. So this is draft control here, so that's arms up, arms down, arms up, arms down. Here's manual control. Arms up, arms down, arms up, arms down. Simple as that. Now, before I hook any of this up, there's one more thing. I know, there's always one more thing. I'm just full of it lately. But this is called the drop retarder stop. And this is another one of those pieces that when I say its name, people get all scared and run away and stop watching my hydraulic videos. And It's not difficult to understand at all. It's so simple. We have a thumb wheel here. There's a spring under it. That spring keeps tension on the thumb wheel so that it doesn't move unless you come down through this opening with a screwdriver or some other prying tool and make it move. And as we thread it in, it comes up against the back of the lift valve, okay? And this is a drop retarder. The further in you thread this, the more it limits how far back the lift valve can move. And if the lift valve can only move back just far enough to just start opening those ports, well, then only a little bit of fluid is going to be able to come out of that lift cylinder, and your arms are going to drop nice and slow because you've basically just cracked the faucet and there's just a trickle flowing. That's all that's happening here. Or if you want your lift arms to drop a lot faster, you just thread that out. That lets our lift valve go back a lot further, opens those dump ports a lot further, more fluid flows out of the cylinder faster, and the arms go down faster. That's all this does. It's got a really scary name, but it's just a bolt. So to make all of our hookups, this rod goes into the hole in the bell crank right there, and this other rod on the top goes into the hole in that upper fork right there. And I need to mention, make sure to put the cotter pin in the bell crank rod. I didn't show it on camera, but if I don't mention it, someone will flag me on it. So the rest of it just attaches with this plate down to the bottom of the housing. And remember, we need our two little standoff spacer washers between the plate and the housing. So this side just uses a regular bolt, standoff washers on there. Start the bolt into the threads. And same for the other side, the two washers go between the plate and the housing, and our drop retarder stop acts as our bolt over here. Now that we're tight down here, it's easy to see how the cam works on the cam follower right here. And that is what gives us the pivot action back here, pushes both of these rods forward, again engages master, engages lift, makes arms go up, then it lets arms go down. We've been there, done that. So I think I've been about hard enough on y'all for one day. I can just show you the wear plate here on this cover that has the hole in it. So the wear plate is something Minneapolis Moline made to drop down between the cam and cam follower, and it's just what it's called, a wear plate. And it is under the top cover. Here's an interesting bit of information. When I cleaned it up, I found the serial number for the 3-point lift. This has nothing to do with the tractor, but these early lifts all got their own number, SNB3239. So that's where you can find a serial number on an earlier lift, and that cover would go up top, and all that is held on by the 4 bolts, 1 bolt in each corner. It's too late in the day, I can't start threads. There we go. Next, a small little housekeeping type chore, getting the lever stops back on for aux 1 and aux 2. And finally, sealing the drilling passages in the side of the housing with the pipe plugs. Why can't you ever start threads when you're on camera? I don't know. There. I think we can call it a day. Okay, everybody, levers and rods. Like I said going into this, it's all levers and rods. Nothing too complicated once you can visualize the movement. So the plan for next time is to put all of this control assembly onto the main lift. I'd also like to finish out with the piston cylinder and have a fully assembled lift unit that can go on the back of the tractor. That may be a bit optimistic, but that is the plan. And I decided to stop short of assembling this external centering device because for the fellow tractor nerds like myself, there's quite a yarn that I can spin about how that external device replaced this internal centering device. So be on the lookout for that. Exciting times. All right, everyone, that's as far as we go today. Thank you once again for watching. I really appreciate those of you who are still sticking with me on this. I know we've lost a lot of people these last few episodes because I think it's more than they want to get into, but like I say, once you understand it, it's really not that bad. So the adventure continues. Hope to see y'all back again.